Hello everyone, good day and welcome to our webinar today on COP26 and what it means for maritime. I am Lindsey Keeble, I'm Global Co-Head of the Maritime sector here at WFW, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Darr, Executive Vice President of Maritime Policy and Government Affairs from the MSC Group, Michael Parker, Chairman of Global Shipping, Logistics and Offshore with Citibank, and my colleague Valentina Keys, who is a specialist maritime environmental lawyer here at WFW. So we're going to have about 45 minutes worth of discussion. If you want to ask questions, at the bottom of the screen, you'll see that there's a Q&A box, so you can ask questions. It'd be nice if you identify yourself, and if we don't get around to answering your question during the panel, then we can come back to you afterwards. So let's kick off. Bard, Michael, you're recently returned from Glasgow, so I hope that you're well rested, and we're really looking forward to hearing your insights. I suppose maybe to kick off at a macro level, how do you think the big policy decisions affect shipping? I don't know if Bard, you want to start with that one.
Sure, and it's great to be here today. Thanks for the invitation, and good to be back from Scotland. I still don't quite get the concept of haggis, but someday maybe somebody will enlighten me. But it was, a week that was honestly about as I expected in the macro picture. With you look at, the broader results, they're going to be disappointing, I think, to most external objective observers. There were three main things that came out. One was a sort of soft commitment to phase down usage of coal, and that actually had the potential to disrupt the final outcome completely, because they do work by consensus, and India and China insisted on watering down the word phase out to phase down, which certainly sends a signal on that. And then with regard to fossil fuel subsidies, there was a commitment in the final resolution to eliminate inefficient subsidies of fossil fuels, which is intentionally ambiguous, and I think it leaves plenty of room to work for whoever is looking at it from the various perspectives. And then the third item was related to what is quite frankly a kind of stunning underperformance on the commitments that were made almost 12 years ago at COP15 for developed countries to provide funding to developing countries. It just is what it is, and the developing countries are insisting more and more for more of that. So if you look at the big picture there wasn't anything that great. There wasn't anything out of the conference resolution that I think says a whole lot to us as shipping, other than there was a gradual shift towards more and more assertive commitments from governments. And I think where shipping came in was several side announcements that were important, including one by a broad series of governments that was committing to reduce methane emissions by 30% by 2030, which sends a signal to anyone choosing an LNG pathway needs to certainly take seriously methane slip and fugitive emissions there. And as a company that is definitely considering that as one of our pathways, we already were taking that seriously, but I think that's a pretty clear signal. There were announcements about shipping, some from within the industry, some outside, but I'm really optimistic about how shipping presented itself at COP26, and I think we just need to carry through on that. It's a great opportunity. If you look at it, the ship owner community is supportive. It went on record 9 months ago almost, saying we need carbon pricing in a global market-based measure. There is a specific proposal for such a market-based measure, one version of it that's gone into IMO, sponsored by ICS and Intercargo. A lot of ship owners prefer that particular one, but irrespective of which side you're on of what's the better method to use, pretty important. Ship owner communities actually made a specific proposal. The third thing was a commitment to net zero for 2050, which was made by ICS, which I'm on the board of, and you see it manifesting itself as well in the Getting to Zero coalition call to action, as well as numerous individual company commitments, such as my company at MSC and many others. I mean, that's the currency we're all trading in now. That's dramatically different than it was 12 or 18 months ago. We've come a really long ways. We presented that well. And then lastly, the proposal to fund a $5 billion research and development fund for research in the area of decarbonization of shipping that ship owners are willing to pay for. They just need governments to facilitate it happening. I just don't understand what could be wrong with that if ship owners are willing to pay. Those are all really good things. We just need to carry that momentum forward and help shape the policy going forward in a way that's workable. And I really think we can get there.
Thanks, Michael. Good to hear your views.
I'm not sure there's much left to say in answer to the question other than to explain the purpose of haggis to Bud, but I'll leave that for another day. I think Bud's covered most of the ground. I think what I would add to that is we know that MEPC 77 is, where the action now moves to in this very specific context of shipping, and I'm sure we'll come back to that. I think the methane issue announcement is very important because I think within shipping, obviously, there's a lot of debate and discussion about LNG. As far as shipping is concerned, of course, the methane slip. And I think methane being on the COP agenda and agreement by a number of countries on that is significant because it puts other greenhouse gases into play that are not currently being measured by the IMO. And I think we're going to be moving away from this word decarbonization to dealing with global warming, and every different form of GHG is going to be discussed. And I know Bud can list them all for us if we asked him to. I think in terms of practical policy, I would refer to the Clydebank Declaration probably as being the most meaningful in the context of shipping, simply because 22 countries very specifically have committed to implement policies and facilitate with finance the creation of these so-called green corridors. I think what was slightly lost in that, although the Getting to Zero Coalition work on green corridors called the next wave, is slightly lost in that, and we'll come back to that, I think, in the discussion. So I think in practical terms, there are things that came out of COP for shipping, and I would also refer to the Transport Day itself in the second week. And I was in the sort of blue zone during the whole day, and I went to a number of other UK government-led meetings, one about aviation. And it's quite clear that shipping is way ahead of aviation in addressing these issues. And it's not aviation's fault, it's just a matter of the difference in getting big planes up in the air with zero emission fuels compared to the task that shipping has. And I think that distinction is going to become increasingly important. The call to action, which Bud referred to now with over 200 signatories, that drew a lot of attention. It was behind a number of the announcements of various countries. So that effort by the Getting to Zero Coalition, I was on the so-called COP26 task force that led that initiative. I think that really did have an impact. Partly, of course, we'll see when MEPC 77 has happened, whether it's had a big enough impact in terms of the IMO's ambition. And I think the other thing which we'll have to see, of course, is whether the IMO's role as the global regulator has been either reinforced by COP or weakened by COP, and we'll have to see later this month. So that's my brief answer to your first question.
Thanks, Michael. Valentina, I don't know if there's anything you'd like to chip in at this stage.
Just to add to those two really comprehensive responses, that the methane pledge is very significant for shipping, obviously, and sends a very strong signal to those shipping companies that are choosing LNG. But I hear some positive kind of voices in the industry saying that LNG can be refined and perfected to eliminate methane. So I know that there's a lot of great work being done in that sphere to address that issue. And I think that the pledge in itself sends a very clear regulatory message on methane. And also to add that it was disappointing to see that the loss and damage fund wasn't agreed, because that leaves the vulnerable nations all the more vulnerable, and they get no compensation for the loss and damage that they endure because of climate change. So that's obviously one of the biggest disappointments to come out of COP26 at the macro level. But at a micro level, for just speaking about shipping, I think it was a really positive event which showcased the decarbonization efforts by the leaders in the shipping world and the level of ambition. And I think, over 60 countries sent a very clear signal to the IMO that net zero targets need to be set ASAP, so that there is that very strong regulatory framework in place to bring those ambitions into effect on a level playing field.
I think, Michael, one of some things that we talked about last week, that even if it wasn't the #1 focus for the big policy makers, I think what was quite clear is that the private events and the things that are happening on the sidelines around the big COP26 were really, really good for shipping, as Valentina said, very, very positive message. So I think that topic of the private industry, not just looking at the public and the regulators, came out very clearly from this COP26 for shipping.
Yes, and I think we had been concerned at one point. We thought that shipping might get actually referred to in the leaders' communique, but actually, as Catherine Palmer, who was the climate champion, did an excellent job at sort of helping identify sort of shipping in a different way. The leaders merely mentioning it wasn't nearly as good as all the both side events and the events that took place on Transport Day. And I think the Green Corridors initiative, I think, is very important, because we need to see large-scale projects with large-scale financial commitments from governments, from the private sector, in order to accelerate the process. Because we know the technology is there, it may not be fully there, and we know there needs to be scaled up, and we know that infrastructure and distribution of new fuels obviously is key to that. But the two routes chosen in the Getting to Zero Coalition New Wave is actually, things that people will understand. So I see it no different from really some of the early big projects around LNG that created LNG as a fuel and LNG as a fuel being transported on ships. So these are things that I think will begin to happen next year. And it will be, I think, about the private sector actually giving a lead. I think, as we've seen from the more enlightened companies in the industry, people are doing things even though regulation does not yet exist in many cases. And I think we're going to, one of the key words, I think, to me that came out particularly on Transport Day was this word certification. What people who are already investing in these technologies, whether it is on a small scale around hydrogen, whether it's on a big scale around ammonia, what they need is the classification societies to certify, and then regulation will follow. As Nick Brown of Lloyd's Register reminded me, LNG on ships happened before it was regulated. Regulation followed the certification by class societies. And I think we're going to have to see more of that. And it's partly because investors and financial institutions will want to see that. And that I think will start to unleash a lot of this initiative from the private sector, and governments will catch up. But I think through COP, they've certainly, in many cases, come forward and said they will support it. And we've just got to make sure that in the private sector, we keep the pressure on governments to make things happen as necessary.
But I think you sort of already touched on some of the things coming out from the maritime side already. But I think it was pleasing to see that the enthusiasm from the shipowning community. Would you echo that?
Yeah, I was really taken during the International Chamber of Shipping side event on Saturday. It just how positive the energy was among the shipowning community. It's just not something I've really seen before, although I've seen the momentum building, that, hey, we're starting to see some pathways where this can really happen. We're starting to see some partners that at least are saying the right things. And I agree with Michael that the controlling path here is really going to be not the equipment. I mean, if you want to build a ship that can run on methanol, that's not hard. That technology's here. If you want to build a ship that can run on bio or synthetic LNG, it's very simple. Build a ship on a conventional LNG design and you're there. But actually having those alternative fuels, whether it's green methanol, synthetic or bio LNG, or green ammonia or green hydrogen, that's going to be, where the real challenge is not only developing the fuels and bringing them to the marketplace, and for shipping to be able to compete for those. Because if we think they're good energy carrier ideas, there's going to be a lot of other energy users out there that are going to need them. But it's got to travel through a midstream infrastructure that largely doesn't exist yet, and then a delivery infrastructure downstream to actually get it into the tanks on the ships. So that part upstream, I think, is really important, from production to actually delivery to where the ships are. Really needs a lot of help from governments to get there. And we can send our demand signal, and we send them. Believe me, I don't think there's anybody in the energy providing business that doesn't know we're looking at a wide range of options and which ones they are. I mean, not a day goes by when I'm not having a conversation with at least one of them. But they need broader incentive than, frankly, the very small amount of energy usage that comes from the shipping sector compared to the broader energy consumption picture. So I think as governments look for ways that they can help us, they also can help themselves in the broader energy picture and getting these low or zero carbon fuels to the marketplace and actually delivered, not just theoretically something that you can purchase on a commodities market. But I think the energy is really positive. We can see technology being there in large part and definitely winning the race right now. I still have some questions as to whether or not we'll be able to scale up fuel cells to reach their maximum potential, but we can decarbonize without them. That would just be a nice to have. And there's definitely some more R&D that's got to happen faster, but it's winning the race by far. It's really going to come down to a race of give us the fuels, and give us the fuels in the volumes and at some sort of a price that the market, can take eventually, because ultimately the customers, have to pay for this, or the companies don't, maintain enough profitability to stay in business. So that's a cold reality of decarbonization throughout the world, is there's a cost, and the cost ultimately has to be paid.
Yeah. Then you talked about that, the sort of R&D, and you said that the ship owners are behind implementing that fund for shipping, I suppose. But what would your big question be, or your big wish for the policymakers to make that fund actually manifest itself and be useful to the industry?
Simple. The proposal is laid out. It's in front of the IMO. Remove the political obstacles between themselves that really have nothing to do with an R&D fund, and agree to set up the infrastructure and let ship owners begin funding it and utilizing that to catalyze some of these last things that need to be done on the R&D side for the shipboard technology, so we make sure we're ready to receive and consume these fuels as they become available. And independent projects will continue going. I mean, we've got one that was announced today. We have many others in the pipeline or that we're already working on a wide range of fuels, but they won't be at the scale to solve the problem for the whole industry if they're not done on a broader scale than company by company. So we really do need to pool our efforts and our resources here.
Michael, one of the declarations that came out was the cargo owners for zero emissions vessels, and I'd just be interested to get your view from a sort of finance and insurance perspective, what that means for the finance and insurance industries.
Well, I think I see it as the third of four legs, if you like, that we started with the Poseidon Principles. Number 2 was the Sea Cargo Charter. Number 3 is this COSEV initiative, which I'll come back to. And then the fourth will be what the insurance sector may choose to do in a similar way. I think so it's about, if you like, how shipping works. So it's about how it's financed. It's about how without insurance, there is no finance. Without insurance, there's no operations in practice. So those are two key sectors, finance and insurance. But the predominant way of repaying and getting a return on your finance, of course, is the cargo and what you charge to carry the cargo. So the Sea Cargo Initiative, the number of signatories to that increases and will soon, no doubt, overtake the number of signatories to the Poseidon Principles, because there are more bulk and commodity companies than there are shipping banks. The COSEV Alliance, though, I think is the most important in a way, because you have these major consumer companies recognizing the pressure they are going to come under from their customers. And I think what this does is actually put this issue in a way that the shipping industry has never really experienced outside cruise, and that is the consumer is watching. And so this connects everything we're doing in shipping to the consumer, whether it is through goods that go in a container for a consumer company, or indeed, the fuel on a tanker that ends up in a petrol pump that, gets put into a car. So to me, this represents the engagement of the ultimate payer for all this, the consumer. Now, we know the consumer is willing to pay a very small increase in the price of freight to, in effect, decarbonize shipping. We've heard that from Soren Skov, from all the other container shipping companies, MSC and CMA CGM, obviously. And so we know they'll pay for it. And I think this link is therefore important. But of course, it is rather like we talked about in the Poseidon Principles, carrots and sticks. The fact that they have put this 2040 date on the elimination of fossil fuels in their supply chain clearly, puts LNG in focus. At least LNG as it currently is, as opposed to synthetic equivalents. And I think we'll see, as the data is going to be key, the emissions data becomes more and more public, and the technology that is already in trial around live streaming that data. So we're going to see many, many more companies, and ultimately consumers, of course, be watching the emissions. And that, I think, is where the lowering of emissions will get tracked very well. But it will also, I think, help motivate and accelerate the collaboration we've talked about to get on with the zero emission fuels and the shipyards to design the vessels that will run on zero emission fuels. So these things can sometimes be seen as one or the other. They're not. They have to work together. And I think the more pressure put on the cargo as much as on the ship owners, then that will help speed up this process. I think we should also expect more signatories. So, the number was quite small, they're quite important. I think we should probably expect to see many more become signatories to that over the course of the next 12 months.
One thing I read, Bud, from the COSEV was we are not going to entertain LNG. So I think it'd be interesting to understand what you think this means, and is this a realistic demand? And I suppose whether there's more clarity needed from COSEV as to what their requirements are going to be, because from what I've read, that didn't come across very clearly.
Yeah, I read with great interest the original announcement that came out. And I think it's great that our customers are sending that signal that they want us to decarbonize. We do too, as quickly as we can. But when you use the phrase zero emission on its own and you don't clarify what you mean, it leaves a lot of open questions. I mean, should we be taking net zero fuels off the table or not? I would think you don't want to take those off the table, which could include bio and synthetic forms of LNG. So when they say LNG, I mean, are they really meaning the bio and synthetic forms that can have a very positive effect being excluded? I don't think so. But you run into the same question with methanol as well, whether it's synthetic production or bio production, and I don't think we want to take that off the table. So I think we need to be careful with the phrase, because I'm not sure, and I read it very carefully, and it wasn't real clear to me exactly what was being said with it. But if the principle means net zero, I get it. We're totally on board. That's exactly where we're trying to go. They just would like to see it happen 10 years faster, and frankly, we would too if it's achievable to do that. The other thing about it is I think it's important that we understand that I do think Michael's right. The consumer, at the end of the day, probably doesn't mind paying a nominal amount more for a single unit of a consumer good, whether it's a flat screen television or an expensive pair of trainers or, you name it. The cost starts to be more impactful on transport, the lower the value of the consumer good that's shipped. So, for example, lawn furniture that takes up a lot of volume inside a container but doesn't really sell for a lot per unit might be impacted more. But at the end of the day, the consumer generally will signal, these sound like reasonable amounts extra we're willing to pay, and in some other parts of their life they're going to have to pay more for decarbonization anyway. But those aren't the people we're dealing with when we are selling our services. We're dealing with non-vessel operators and beneficial cargo owners are basically our customers. And they need to get on message with that. And so, for example, in that same week when that announcement was made, I think it was literally the next day. I mean, there was another article that featured a prominent large beneficial cargo owner that said, well, we don't think decarbonization, essentially, decarbonization should result in any additional cost for shippers. I'm looking at that going, I'm sorry, in the rest of my life, I expect this to have some cost. Why wouldn't it have some costs there? We need to be on this journey together. And I think it's important we be on it together and use that commitment from our customers as a really positive rallying sign and signal rather than something that divides us into different tribes. And I will point out, when we talk about the scale of what this cost might mean, the recent fluctuations that we've seen in the marketplace for shipping consumer goods driven by volume surges and declines in the COVID pandemic and congestion that's occurred through the supply chain are pretty dramatic compared to the kind of numbers you're looking at with an increase of fuel costs, even in the multiples of, say 2.5 to 8 times, which I think is the right range. So, I think it's achievable to do all this, but we need to be realistic about it. We've all got to do our part, just as you and I and all the fellow panelists do as consumers.
Thanks, Bud. I think it might be helpful, I don't know if Michael, you want to take this one, or Bud, but just to summarize a bit more about the Clydebank Declaration and why this is important and what it should achieve for the maritime industry.
Well, I think maybe I'll kick off. I was there watching our shipping minister, Robert Courts, sort of chair the panel, which included several transport ministers, including the US, Denmark, and Germany. I think this is important because it's two things. One is it's well to wake, and we've been talking so far tank to wake. So a lot of the new initiatives are really going to be what I think everyone sort of accepts is you've got to look at this properly. So you can't effectively move emissions somewhere else. And so eventually, of course, that will include in this the building of the ships, the zero emission vessels will eventually, of course, get included in the well to wake shipping emissions. I just want to quote you a bit from the actual declaration. It says that the signatories recognize that a rapid transition in the coming decade to clean maritime fuels, zero emission vessels, alternative propulsion systems, and the global availability of landside infrastructures to support these is imperative for the transition to clean shipping. The signatories of this declaration assert the need for the formation of an international coalition between ambitious governments to act together and demonstrate that maritime decarbonization is possible while unlocking new business opportunities and socio-economic benefits for communities across the globe. Now, it's easy to say, these are sort of words that civil servants can write down and everyone can sign up to, but I think there are some key things in there about global availability of landside infrastructure. And I think the word demonstrate is very important. This is governments committing to enable real things to happen. Now, you can argue that the way in which they then sort of indicate what the definition, if you like, of two governments getting together to agree a corridor, you could argue that that's some way off what we've done in the Getting to Zero coalition of actually identifying two very specific cargo routes. But I think, this is the sort of commitment that 22 governments signing is difficult to say, they didn't know what they were signing. It's not a very long declaration. It's not very complicated. And I think that is why it is significant. It's also why it was sort of kept under wraps until actually announced on Transport Day on COP26. And I think that sort of brings me back to slightly your original question, which was on Transport Day, from what I could see, and not just the events that Bud has referred to around the sort of outside of COP that the shipping industry put on, was, I think, frankly, shipping was the only thing where anything serious was actually announced on Transport Day. I mean, there were meetings around freight, road freight and cars, but we all can see that. We can see the electric vehicles on the road. We're all being encouraged eventually to buy one, and trains too, and electric powered, land transport. Those are things that, governments, of course, have to do the infrastructure around charging stations, and et cetera, et cetera. But that's, everyone understands that can be done and is being done. But in terms of shipping, I think it was where the major announcement was. And I think the Clydebank Declaration for shipping, could become a very important and significant step in what we're talking about, because we will we, the industry, will hold those governments to account. And those governments do include island states like the Marshall Islands, potential fuel producers like Morocco and Chile, most of the major European countries, of course, the United States and Canada, and Japan and Australia. So embedded in the Clydebank Declaration actually are the countries that are on the routes that the Getting to Zero Coalition has announced in the next wave. So that's my take on it, is that it was the most serious announcement of Transport Day, and we must continue to make that point so that governments don't sort of walk away from it.
Yeah, and Michael, I agree with you. I think on Transport Day, we probably did have some of the more significant, certainly sector-specific, if not the most significant series of announcements came out related to shipping. I mean, there were just some really good things, positive things that were tangible. I participated in the rollout for the Sustainable Freight Buyers Alliance initiative as well, which I think is very positive. A group I work on, World Economic Forum, and together with others in transport, fully supports that, together with a book and claim system to help consolidate buying power towards alternative fuels and technologies on behalf of shippers. That's great. I mean, that's the type of collaborative thinking I think that we need. There were really a lot of positive things that happened inside the Blue Zone that day. I also very much agree with you, Michael, that it's not only irresponsible, in my opinion, it's just flat out wrong from a logic perspective to not look at this from a life cycle perspective when we talk about fuels. It really does need to be, from the production to the actual power consumption and usage on board the ship or other conveyance if you're looking at transport more generally. I just think you've got to do that. And I think we have to accept as the industry a willingness to accept the burden for the entire life cycle of the emissions when we look at apples versus apples. If we accept to take the benefit of the life cycle good that comes in the upstream for some of the production of these fuels. And we're of the camp that really thinks that this wide range of fuels that are potentially there need to all be cultivated right now, need to all be encouraged, and let's let the best answers win, but let's give them a running start and let's give them a chance. And I see a role, frankly, whether we're talking about green hydrogen, green ammonia, green methanol, synthetic or bio LNG, or even some others we haven't discussed, such as advanced atomic energy, and maybe in the shorter term bio diesel. They've all got a role to play in this, at least to the point where we evaluate them completely, and the life cycle plays a really important role on that. When it comes to the Clydebank Declaration, I think you're right, Michael. It was drafted by government people with fancy pens, crafting the best they could. I think they did a pretty good job with it. Like you, it sends the right kind of a signal. And although I can't see green corridors being the solution or the end state, we're nowhere near the solution or the end state. I think it really is a good kind of incubator to help focus attention in places where it might make the biggest difference the fastest to catalyze what's needed on the fuel production, fuel delivery, and fuel consumption. Then we can prove the concept and make it work on a bigger scale. I just think the one reservation I have is there are some that support that concept, and we definitely support the concept, but there's some that support the concept that want to limit the choice of fuels to too narrow of a field. And I think that's a mistake at this point, because I think there's a lot of promise out there, but I also don't think any one single fuel is going to hold the ultimate solution. If I'm wrong on that, I'm happy to be wrong, but I don't think it's going to prove itself for a very long time. And we have to do things now. We can't sit back and wait for the perfect solution to come in the future and manifest itself. We need to make progress today.
Thanks, both. I think it's very clear that there's definite real world impetus now for this change and to push, and the private sector is definitely pushing that change. Maybe coming to you in a minute, Bud, about what the IMO can do or is doing. But Valentina, just to turn to you, it's not just shipping regulators that are going to be relevant here, is it? Because there are other regulatory bodies that make big declarations and decisions, such as the EU, and they do perhaps inadvertently, but they do adversely impact shipping as well. So what does the industry need to be doing to be correctly heard by the other regulators?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think shipping needs to be more visible in terms of the positive action that it's undertaking to decarbonize. And there's certainly a lot of positive legislation, ambitious legislation coming from the EU, for example, with the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive that is mandating climate disclosures, mandating ESG disclosures for large corporations. Shipping will also be part of that definition. So from 2023 onwards, shipping will be very much in the spotlight in terms of its carbon footprint, and also the S and the G factors and how shipping companies are complying with those. And UK has its own TCFD mandatory disclosure regime coming in 1st of April next year. That will also drive a lot of disclosure and transparency and hopefully positive change. So yes, shipping doesn't operate in isolation. I think that very much came to the fore at COP26, how relevant shipping is. It can't be left at the back of the queue. In fact, as someone said, it needs to be at the front of the queue, also, having access to low carbon fuels, low carbon technologies. And I think the R&D fund that's being proposed by ICS is really important and very much needed because there's so many unknowns about which technology, which fuel. And, even this debate about LNG, is it viable, is it not? What do the cargo owners, the customers of this world think about LNG? Will their opinion be swayed if LNG was to be shown to be, less polluting, less damaging than it's, criticized for being because of the methane emissions? And I think just to pick up on the Clydebank Declaration, I think it's the most exciting announcement to come out of COP26 for shipping. But, the devil's in the detail, and I like to read the detail because that's, my job. And I was very much surprised by the wording in the annex to the Clydebank Declaration, which says, for greater clarity, all vessels transiting a green corridor would not be required to be zero emissions or to participate in the partnerships. Very interesting wording, because it almost, you make this big announcement and green corridors sound great, just the sort of thing we need, to bring more solidarity between the sectors and more collaboration between ports, between fuel suppliers, between ships. And then you've got this kind of cop-out, as it were, and it means that not all ships sailing through green corridors will have to be zero emissions. So why shoot yourself in the foot straight away? Why lower that level of ambition right at the outset? So I think I agree with Bud and Michael. I think that we can take the idea, we can take the concept, and we can go away and actually perfect it and work with, local governments and other regulators, not just IMO, to see how the green corridor concept can be developed and properly administered and kind of rigorously assessed so that it is a success, because I do think it's a great idea.
Can I just come in on that, because I read exactly the same thing and had the same reaction as Valentina. But the more I thought about it, I thought the reality on the particular one of the corridors, at least in the Getting to Zero coalition we're focused on, of course, goes past China and may, of course, include China, given if China and Australia patch up their differences and iron ore resumes, which I think it has actually. And I suppose what it reflects is the fact that the Green Corridor is going to be a process that takes place over time. And clearly, over time, the zero emission vessels will come in. We know that they won't all come in at once, and therefore that many of those routes will need both the existing fleet as well as the new fleet. I think, and we talked about this tipping point of 5% of all fuels by 2030 being needed to be zero emission in order to make zero emission vessels the requirement, if you like, of ship owners to order, the choice for them to order. And I think that is sort of, I suppose, the point, because the other thing they do talk about in the Clydebank Declaration is within 5 years. And I think that's the other significant thing. This is not one of those 20, 30, 40, 50 dates. They've said within 5 years, which I think gives us the opportunity to put those governments under pressure. And I think the ultimate thing will be go back to the consumer. If you are, whether you're shipping iron ore or a container, if it's on a green corridor, are you using zero emission fuels or not? And I think that's where the consumer choice will begin to, if you like, it'll make what the governments have written less relevant, because most of the cargo will be going in the green corridor as opposed to the brown one next door.
Thanks. Bud, do you want to chip in?
Sure. Would you like me to follow up on your IMO question as well?
Yeah.
Okay. So let me start with picking up where Michael and Valentina left off. I read that sentence as not being a cop-out, but really a dose of pragmatism that was probably necessary in order to make a big announcement, because as Michael points out, this is a now thing. I mean, this isn't a when we get around to it thing. And the reality is now there are 0 of these net zero fuels available to us at scale to deploy today. And we're talking about, a 5-year time frame here to get something going. So I think, as a practical matter, I think it probably needs to play out as Michael says. It's not going to be a step change immediately, but I think it's a really important incubator to prove the concept and prove that you can deliver the fuels and use the fuels safely on trade routes where it actually makes a big difference. And I'm optimistic, like Michael is, that the bulk trade will open up between our two friends in Asia and Australasia. But if I could answer your question about IMO, what can IMO do? I think they can do a couple of things very important. One is we mentioned the R&D fund. Just do it. Just let the industry pay for the R&D fund as we're asking for. That's all we're asking. Step aside, give us the framework, let us pay, and let us make a difference through that. We're willing to do that aside from everything else, and we see that as just being a helpful step while maybe some of the bigger policy issues get argued between governments. I'd like to remind everyone that maybe hasn't been involved in IMO. This is governments. It's now, as of today, 170. I think they just had the 175th member state join. These are governments, and essentially, not quite as many, but essentially the same governments that just participated in COP26. Get over yourselves with the political differences and help us solve a real practical problem. Because us as the ship owners and the shipping community, we want to get there. Work with us and help us do it. And one way to do that is help us set a global carbon pricing mechanism and implement that through a workable market-based measure. I mean, we fully support that as a company. I think you see the ship owning community across the board has come out in support of doing that. Help us do it. And whatever it takes to balance out developed countries and developing countries, governments, please do your part. Do your job. That is the art of diplomacy to make that happen. Please get it done, because it's an important part of setting up the framework we need to get to where we have to go here. The next thing I would say is listen to the currency we're all trading in now. It's net zero for 2050. In 2018, the initial IMO greenhouse gas strategy said 50% greenhouse gas reduction by 2050. That was ambitious at the time. Honestly, at the time, it was, but it's not today. In the framework of looking at it today and the way the options are starting to emerge, it's not far enough. Hear us, work with us, amend that strategy effective in 2023 as planned, and let's set our eyes on that prize. And along with that, as you develop regulations through the IMO to bring that to life and make it a reality, please focus on the big picture, because too much focus disproportionately on carbon intensity, the per unit emissions, can easily distract you and send you in the wrong direction on absolute emissions. It definitely has a role to play, and we should be mindful of it. But there are examples of regulations that have already now been agreed at IMO that actually create some incentives that would, in order to satisfy the carbon intensity requirements, might have you actually increase your absolute emissions. And I really think we need to be thinking about, in 3 years, 5 years, 7 years time, what's our per unit intensity isn't going to be the right language to speak much longer. We really need to be thinking about what helps us truly get to a net zero future in 2050 and reach that end state that we need.
Thanks, Bob. I'm conscious of time, but I'm going to try and get through a couple more of my questions, and we've got loads of questions coming in on the Q&A function as well. So one theme I want to pick up, Michael, both you and Bud, actually, when we spoke last week, mentioned to me about the difference between sort of the aviation industry and shipping and how we need to distinguish ourselves, and that the shipping industry is making great strides. So do you think that means that people are finally beginning to understand the importance of shipping in the global supply chain? Is the message finally getting through?
Well, look, we know from COVID, people, the concept of supply chains, right to the white van at the front door began to matter to people much more than they'd really thought. And then the Ever Given again drew attention to what happens when there's an accident or some sort of delay. So I think that helped put shipping on the front page. But one of the things that I think we are all doing is trying to help the industry tell its story. The narrative of the industry hasn't been told properly. And I think in this whole topic of decarbonisation, we're able actually to tell a much better story, and particularly those companies like the one Bud represents, like Maersk and others, who are at the forefront of some of these technological and fuel innovations. They're doing that. But I think what is equally important is we need to separate the two industries in the mind, not just of the public, but also of governments. They should no longer be lumped together. Shipping is an essential business, a global business that actually helps economies, particularly the developing economies. And as we've seen from the whole issue of the seafarers, we need to significantly improve the way in which seafarers are treated, but also there are other issues around biodiversity in the oceans and things which shipping is going to have to accept not responsibility for, but to address some of the concerns there. Aviation is a voluntary activity that technology enabled us to go long distances in a short period of time. But these are two very different industries. We suggested on Transport Day at one meeting that shipping should have a separate day at COP27, distinct from Transport Day. And I think shipping or supply chains warrant a separate ministry, if you like, in many governments. I think that is the sort of attention that we need to give to shipping, what it means about global supply chains. I've said it many times and I'll say it again. If you decarbonize the shipping industry, you decarbonize all the other industries to some extent whose cargoes are carried on ships. And I think that is increasingly understood by manufacturers and commodity companies, hence the Sea Cargo Charter. And I think that's a very distinct thing from aviation, which is essentially primarily clearly about moving people. And we know, of course, that governments are going to have to do something about aviation emissions through taxation and other issues. So I think it's very important we no longer accept them being joined together where they have common issues. By all means, we should work with them, but we should tell a very different story and make sure that narrative is much better understood by the consumer and government.
Thanks, Michael. I'm going to try and take some of these. There's loads of questions. I've kind of filtered through a few of them, but this first one that came in early on was how will Article 6 of the Paris Agreement impact on the use of voluntary carbon offsets by shipping? I don't know if that's something, Bud, you have it, or Valentina, you have a view on?
Yeah, I have an opinion on that. For our company, it won't make any difference. And Article 6 is mostly intended to be basically trading between parties to the convention, which are our governments. I think it sends a signal and it helps bring maybe some stabilization and continuity to what is otherwise a somewhat inconsistent marketplace as to the quality and integrity of some of those voluntary offsets. You're not hearing the shipping community speak in the same terms that aviation did when they developed CORSIA together with governments and continue to implement it. Generally speaking, the context for out-of-sector offsetting is purely a voluntary mechanism that we offer our customers rather than a primary mechanism towards decarbonization. And in my opinion, that's where the emphasis ought to be, really, is actual decarbonization to the maximum extent possible. And I think offsetting out of sector maybe runs at cross purposes with that end state at times. So I think we need to be very cautious about reading too much into that.
Thanks. There's another question. I'll paraphrase. And then, sorry, Valentina, did you want to say anything else on that one? Yeah, good. And paraphrase one of them on.
Yeah, well, I completely agree with Bud, but just to add that, yeah, it is about better performing countries sharing carbon credits with less performing countries. So that's what Article 6 of the Paris Rulebook is about. But I think what's more needed is international carbon trading, which is aligned with the EU emissions trading scheme that is currently being proposed to be extended to maritime, as we all know. And I think that's European Union's way of leading by example, setting the example for IMO to say there's a big gap at the moment in terms of carbon pricing and in terms of carbon trading. So it'll be very interesting to see whether the IMO actually moves on that in terms of setting an international emissions trading scheme that's akin to the one that's being proposed by the EU. So that's all I wanted to add.
Thank you. Maybe one for Bud, for you, whether you do it, and Michael, whether you'd finance it. Nuclear-powered ships as a possibility was mentioned by John Kerry. What does the panel think about nuclear-powered ships?
Well, those who know me know I started my career as a naval nuclear engineer, but it doesn't lead me in the immediate direction you would think, because I've always been very skeptical of the application of pressurized water reactors of that type to the commercial sector. And I still hold that view today. I don't think those reactors make much sense. However, what's being discussed now in the form of molten salt reactors, which are modular in nature, much more inherently stable, require far, far less operator interaction, and offer some longer term potential beyond just decarbonization in optimizing shipping, I think deserve a look, as does fusion technology, which back when I was starting out in the field was a pipe dream, but now actually getting somewhere and looking like there's going to be a project at some scale, which may have some real promise. Whether or not you can marinize it, I don't know with either of these. However, I do know it's worth a serious look, because it is genuinely, a decarbonized solution if you can manage the other policy and regulatory aspects that go around it. From a technical aspect, I can tell you, I think it has a lot of promise. Whether the cost benefit, the policy, the regulatory fits in are questions yet to be answered.
I would only add that I think it's, in terms of nuclear ships, I think it's a matter of whether the consumer really wants a nuclear ship, turning up in a port near where they live. And that is again a way of a narrative government's going to have to take some time and effort to explain. But I think nuclear power in the generation of electricity is absolutely essential if the world is going to have any chance to meet the 1.5 degrees. And I think that's increasingly been understood. And again, governments are going to have to explain the story. If you close your nuclear power stations and import nuclear generated electricity from another country, are you really being sort of, honest with yourselves about your choices of how you generate energy? So it'll come. And actually in the Climate Bond Initiative rules around shipping, the working group managed to get the nuclear word into the document to contemplate what Bud talks about, that at some point there may well be the technology, there may well be the consumer acceptance of it, and we shouldn't therefore eliminate what is a zero emission fuel option if it's there.
Thanks. There's a question here on the methane pledge and whether perhaps everyone, all the stakeholders have properly understood what the methane pledge means, and be interested to get your views on that, and whether there's maybe more education to make sure that it isn't misunderstood and jumped on by people and taken down the wrong path. Maybe I've misinterpreted the question, but that's fine.
Yeah, I'll take a stab at it. I think it's important to look at the context. It wasn't politically possible to have that within the resolution. So it's not as if COP26 agreed to it, but a significant number of governments did. And I think it's a recognition of what Michael mentioned earlier, which I think is important. I think we all are these days kind of tending to use decarbonization as shorthand for either stopping global warming or reducing greenhouse gas emissions, which is a much broader category. And I think we need to be thinking in those terms, because otherwise you're just kind of squeezing on a balloon and you solve one problem and another one emerges. And I think we do need to look at that bigger picture. I think technically, I think the energy producers will solve the upstream part of that, which is going to be the key to whether methane in any form has a long-term future in a decarbonized world as a fuel. I think that the shipboard technology part has come a very, very long ways in a short time. I think that's going to be a negligible part of the conversation going forward with the new technologies that are being deployed even today. But that upstream is a big unknown that the energy providers are going to have to deal with. It's a serious problem, has to be taken seriously, and we do need to be looking at greenhouse gases holistically, not just thinking about CO2. And I think that that agreement between those governments sends an important signal in that regard.
Maybe this is a yes/no answer. Was there a shipyard present at COP26?
Yes. A number of shipyards were there and very engaged. But I think it is a case of them being encouraged. It goes back to my point about certification. If pressure is put on the shipyards to come up with the designs that will work with the different fuels, then I think the classification societies will be there to help that process. So they were very much there, but I don't think they're going to lead on this. They need encouragement. And I think something like the Green Corridors will help because they can see the huge opportunity. And let's not forget, this is the best opportunity this industry has had, certainly in my lifetime, to actually re-engineer itself in a very different way and be profitable as a result of it. And I think the shipyards see that opportunity from replacing the global fleet in quite a short period of time.
All of the other questions that I haven't got to, I will get, if they're to Bud or Michael, I'll get answers, but we will come back to you to the extent you've left your name. But maybe just as a wrap up, I think from what I'm hearing, I think the GMF and I think Catherine Palmer, as you touched upon earlier, Michael, as climate champion and for shipping to the COP26, he's done a fantastic job for the industry. And I think it's clear that things are moving in the right direction. And unlike what Greta says, I don't think it's all been blah, blah, blah. I think there's been a lot of good decisions made here. So I'd just be interested, sort of final parting comment from each of you, looking forward to MEPC 77 and what your hope is for that. Michael, do you want to kick us off? Or Bud, you're unmuted, Bud, go for it.
Happy to do it either way. I'd say first and foremost, don't have inflated expectations for what this particular MEPC session will do. This is a journey that's on particular process constraints and on a particular timeline. So it's not as if they can say, oh, some good announcements came out, we're going to go do all those things. That's not the way that particular UN diplomatic process works. However, there is the opportunity to grasp the momentum towards net zero for 2050 and send a very clear signal that as they charter work to revise the greenhouse gas strategy, that should be a starting point for the discussion that will have to take place between governments to turn that into real life. And also, just do the research and development fund. Just get out of our way and let us do it. We want to pay for it. It will help. There's nothing bad that comes from it. And third, I think there will be some discussion that helps give momentum towards a global market-based measure. What form that should take is a much harder question, but I think that there's enough demand signal out there from a variety of stakeholders that they can send that signal to get that work moving, which is already underway, by the way, but moving with a little better momentum than it has right now.
I agree with Bud. I mean, I think the current ambition of 50% is just so out of date now. I mean, it's only 2 years since they came up with that. So a clear signal about zero in 2050 is important. As I mentioned in an event I spoke at, the Poseidon Principles will move, I'm sure the signatories will all agree to the Paris Agreement effectively as the trajectory that we will look to. And I think that will be the pressure on the IMO. I think it's also important for the IMO and also for the industry that they don't allow individual governments to sort of overtake on regulation. Of course, the EU, the US, every government is going to have its role to play in that. But I think for the IMO to retain what we value in the industry, its role as a global regulator, it's got to be seen to be understanding what society wants and to play that role. So that's, I think, what we need to at least see come out of MEPC 77, even if some of the specifics, won't come out till say 2023. We need to see a clear pathway that all of us can work to.
Thank you. And Valentina, final word from you before we wrap up. Thanks.
Yeah, well, I can't really perfect those answers, but just to wrap up, what is hoped from MEPC 77 is net zero target for shipping, 2050, carbon levy, carbon fund of 5 million, which there are 260 R&D projects currently waiting to be funded, and they potentially hold the answers and the solutions to many questions that are being asked, including that on methane and LNG. And lastly, it is hoped that there'll be some sort of global market-based mechanism discussed, at least in draft, put together, which may look like an international emissions trading scheme, as I mentioned earlier. So big hopes for MEPC 77, but I understand that lots of things can be adopted at this meeting, but in terms of things coming into fruition, it won't be until MEPC 78, which I understand will be in June next year. And yes, as Michael and Bud pointed out, shipping really has the chance to take control of the narrative and write its own story, its own success story in terms of decarbonization. So I think it's really important that the various pledges and alliances that were formed during COP, in the run-up to COP, that they're not empty promises, and that shipping companies are supported by regulators through very clear, stringent regulation in terms of how to get there.
Thank you very much. Huge thank you, Michael, Bud, for joining us today. Your time is precious. We really appreciate it. And thank you to everyone that tuned in. And if you probably will receive a feedback form, so please do take a couple of minutes to feed that in if you do. And hope to see you all soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. It was a pleasure to be here.